This should look familiar here. Jenny went over this earlier. So this is just basically a heat map, right, of all the species that we see in North America. And areas that you see that are red means there's a lot of different types of bumblebee species in that area. And in Nebraska, we're in a unique location because we get species that are typically found in the western United States and in the eastern United States. So if you're into birds or plants, and you know how you usually have to get the guidebooks for the eastern and the western, same for the bumblebees, right? We have lots of species that sort of kind of overlap here right in the center. And we also see some interesting color variations because of that mix. So Jenny also mentioned that we see lots of variation, right? So there's going to be variation within and between species. There's going to be variation in size when you're looking at if it's a queen, which are usually your largest bees, your males, which are a little bit smaller than the queen, and the workers, which fall somewhere in the middle. They can be pretty big or they can be pretty runty sometimes. So it's not always the size that we're looking at to identify, and it's not always the color because all of these things can vary. So it's a little bit difficult, but we're going to work through it. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to teach you how to identify, right? It's not that hard. This is beautiful here. But the first thing that you have to start with is, do you even have a bee in front of you? Which sounds simple, but it is not usually, right? So here, people that have written books about bees have actually used flies on their front cover. Right? There's lots of mimicry going on in the insect world. So we're going to walk through this process here and figure out if we even have a bee and then what to do with it. So let's differentiate between flies and bees, right? So the first main thing is that bees have 4 wings. They have 2 on each side. So if you look in this top picture here, it's kind of hard to differentiate the 2 because they actually join. When bees are in flight, their wings join. But they have a forewing and a hind wing, whereas flies only have 2 wings. Their second wing has actually been lost through evolution, and it's this really tiny little thing right here that's now just used for balance. So bees have 4 wings, flies have 2 wings. The next thing you want to look at is this insect that you have carrying a large amount of pollen? If so, you have a bee. Flies, on the other hand, generally have hind legs that are a little bit like chicken legs, right? They're not carrying pollen. They don't want to carry pollen. They don't need it. The next thing we can look at is the amount of hair. Now, this is not always, but generally speaking, and especially for bumblebees, they're all going to be very hairy. Flies are typically not as hairy as bumblebees, but they can be. But typically they're not. And next we can look at antennae. Bees have very long antennae, as you can see coming right off of this bee here. And flies typically have these short, stubby antennae. Okay, so like 4 wings. Is it carrying pollen? Is it hairy? How long are its antennae? And the last thing you can sort of look at in the field is its eyes. Oops. So bees have 2 compound eyes that tend to sit on the side of their head. And flies have those very cartoony, buggy fly eyes, right? They're huge, they're bulgy, and they usually meet at the top of their head. Those 2 eyes, they connect there almost, and bees are sitting on the side. Is that pretty clear? Anyone have any questions on how to tell? Seems easy, right? Now we're going to go through a little test of it, though. What do we have here? How do we know that's a fly? 2 wings. What else? Short antennae. And it's got chicken legs, right? But this thing is hairy. It kind of looks like a bee. And the eyes, yep. How about this one? Bee. How come? Lots? Yep. So right away, if you see a huge pollen ball, you know that that's going to be a bee. And we're going to try one more here. What's this one? Are you sure? So what are some of the things that you want to look for between a fly and a bee? The eyes. So we see bulgy bug eyes, right? What about these? Very short. Kind of chicken legs. Chickeny, yeah. And it's only got 2 wings, but this looks very much like a bumblebee, right? So in the field, you just have to be sure and look for these things because you can do it. No, this is not a bee fly. This is a type of syrphid fly or flower fly. Syrphid fly? Yeah. Okay, another one that we want to be aware of is the difference between wasps and bees. Seems self-explanatory, but once you get into the field and you're just looking to catch insects, you're gonna think that a wasp might be a bee because you want to catch anything that's moving on a flower all of a sudden. So just to go over it, wasps, as we all know, they kind of have that intimidating look, right? They have very strong color patterns on them, but wasps do not carry pollen generally. They have those hind legs that are not built for carrying pollen. They're not very hairy. But very, very strong color patterns that are made out of the actual exoskeleton or a skin, which is sort of like a fingernail almost, is what the exoskeleton might be like. Whereas your bumblebee patterns that you see are going to come from different hair colors. So now that we're sure that we have a bee, right? If we don't have a bee and you're curious, you can go to this website here called bugguide.net. Very handy for finding out what type of insect you have. But the next step in the process is figuring out if our bee is a bumblebee. So when we look for bumblebees, they are large, right? You can hear them. You can generally recognize when it's a bumblebee. Many of them have black and color or black and yellow color patterns, but they can also have orange and white. If you go out towards western Nebraska, we have a lot of species there that have more color in them. And bumblebees will have what we call a corbicula, which if you look on their hind leg here, it's sort of a hollowed out basket that allows them to sort of place a whole bunch of pollen when they're flying around. If you look in this photo, you can see that she's starting to get some pollen in her basket there. Corbicula, Corbicula. Did I win the spelling bee? Thank you. Corbicula. No. So when you look at the hind leg of a female bumblebee, they have a very large triangular section. Yep. Honeybees do, but most other bees use hairs to collect pollen. Yeah. So again, you're going to want to catch everything that's flying, right? So when you see honeybees out there, they're not bumblebees. These are generally honey-colored or orange. They have stripes on them. They've got more of a torpedo shape when you look at a honeybee versus a bumblebee that's a little bit more robust. Honeybees have hairy eyes, if you have the ability to see that close. And yeah, pretty distinct between the two, but just something to be aware of to don't go around catching all the honeybees, right? Yep. If you look at this photo here, their eyes, they actually have very minute hairs on their eyes. On the eyes. Yeah. It's typically found in your younger honeybees than the older ones, but yeah. A species you might get confused with a bumblebee is the Carpenter Bee. Right, these look very similar to bumblebees, but what you're going to notice is that carpenter bees don't have very much hair on their abdomen or the butt, right? So on this back part here, it's very shiny, it's bare or bald, and these do not have a corbicula. Instead, on their hind legs, they have hairs. Males of carpenter bees have a yellow spot on their face, which is kind of distinct between a bumblebee and a carpenter bee. It almost looks like the males are wearing a mask. So if you catch a bee that looks like it has a mask on its face, it's probably a carpenter bee. They also have a very different nesting structure. So many of our carpenter bees will nest in hardwood and sort of make a tunnel within the wood rather than in a colony. So we're going to take a test here and see if we can figure out if it's a carpenter bee or a bumblebee. Are you ready? And how do we know that? Well, this one has some pollen in her hind leg too. The hairs, yep. So the hair is the key factor here because these bees are about the same size. They'll make about the same amount of noise. One of them is going to have hair on the abdomen. One of them will not. Yep. So there are some other sweat bees that can do buzz pollination as well, but I don't think carpenter bees will do buzz pollination. Okay, so now we're sure that we've got a bumblebee, right? We worked through if it's a fly, if it's a different type of bee. If you have a different type of bee and you're interested in knowing what it is, a good website is discoverlife.org. Or Bug Guide. Bug Guide also works for that too. Okay, so now we're going to dive in a little bit deeper. Do we have a female or a male bee? So this looks very scary, right? Lots of different things on here, but we've already talked about all of these. So we have the head, the thorax, which is like the middle section of an insect. This is where all the legs attach and the wings attach. And then we have the abdomen or the butt. So these three sections here are how we identify different species because they'll have different color patterns. But when we're looking if it's a male or a female bee, you want to look at the antennae, which are made up of flagellomeres, and sometimes the eye and the pollen basket, right? Because male bumblebees do not collect pollen, right? They don't really have a role in the colony. They come out to mate, but they don't forage. They don't take care of the nest. They're not there to help raise the brood. They're just there to mate. So they don't have a purpose in collecting pollen, so they do not have a pollen basket. So now we're going to go between male and female bees, right? And it's true. It's true. We've got shaggy males here. So females, they just generally have a more well-groomed appearance to them when you look at them relatively, right? You can see that this one just looks a little bit shaggier. And it's not always the case, but many times the male bees have long, uneven hairs. The next thing you want to look for is the hind leg, right? So here we have the female with the corbicula, that big triangular portion, and you can see that the male bee does not have that. He has hairs in there, and it's a little bit slimmer. The next thing we want to look at is the number of tergites. And tergites are essentially sections that make up the abdomen. So on a bee's abdomen, we have 6 different sections on a female and 7 sections on a male. So you don't need to go and count all those little sections, but just realize that the male bees will be a little bit longer, sometimes a little bit narrower. They're not as robust, although they can be. They're just a little bit longer in most cases. And males also have an extra antennal segment. So again, I'm not going to ask you to go and count all of these little tiny segments of a bee's antennae, but sometimes you can tell the sex based off of the length. And it's hard in the beginning until you sort of have that understanding of what a normal length is. But if you have 2 species side by side, which Doug can probably show later in his group, you can really see that males do have longer antennae in a lot of specimens. Males sometimes can also have bulgy eyes. So when we look at these two, we can see the females here are just normal and set right in her face, and the male is a little bit more bug-eyed. And then lastly is the stinger. So male bees do not have stingers. They cannot sting you. So you can pick up a male bee, use it as a cool party trick. But females, while they do have stingers, bees are usually so focused when they're out on foraging bouts that they don't want to sting you, right? They're there to collect their pollen and collect their nectar and fly back to feed their colony. If they sting you, that just takes a whole lot of time out of their day that they don't want to deal with. So you can get very close to bumblebees many times in the field. You can even pet them. Yep. Yes, they can sting you multiple times, but they really don't want to. Okay, so once you know that you have a female or a male, the last thing that you have to check before moving on to the key is if it's normal or cuckoo. So Jenny mentioned this a little bit, and just like we have cuckoo birds that can take over a nest, we have cuckoo bees that can take over a nest. So these bees are not as common, but they essentially time their takeover of the nest, right? So when a queen has established her nest, she has a few workers in there. They're carrying out the foraging now. The parasitic bee can essentially go in there and kill the queen, and then the workers start responding to her. So she doesn't have a need for collecting pollen. She essentially takes over a nest that has already started and then starts to lay her eggs there. So cuckoo bees, they're a little bit harder to identify, but it's going to be okay. And if you catch one, that's going to be very amazing because I have been looking for bees for about 5 years now and I have never caught one. So if you catch one, I'm going to be ecstatic for you. So first we're going to look at the cuckoo bees between the male and the cuckoo. And what we're looking at here is the hind leg. So these are both going to be chicken legs, but one of them is more chicken than the other. It's a very faint difference. So what we have here, this is the male cuckoo bee, hind leg right here. And this is the male bee. Cuckoo bee, it's a little thinner and it looks a little hairier. Male bee, very faint. And then when we look at the females, this is a female cuckoo, so it looks very similar to a male bee's leg, right? And then you have the female. So you can see that she has a large bare space on her hind leg. Cuckoo, female. So this is just something to check when you do collect a bee to see if it's a cuckoo or not. Another thing about cuckoo bees is they have very sparse hairs. So what we're looking at here is the abdomen. This is a normal bumblebee, right? And you can see that she's got thick bands of hair on all sections of her abdomen. Whereas the cuckoo bee, it's balding a little bit on most of those sections. Yep. The role of it, it's just advanced evolution. Like they don't need to go out and collect pollen to reproduce. So most of our goal in life is to reproduce, right? Pass on your genetics. And cuckoos have essentially skipped the step of needing to forage and put out all the effort to find that home and make your colony. They just go in to essentially a furnished nest with their workers and their food. It's like a hotel for them, and they get to pass on their genetics. It's just an advanced way of living. Yep. The queen that was there in the beginning, whatever brood she laid are going to come out as normal bumblebees, but that colony is not likely to rear a new queen, right? So that's going to rear many new cuckoos that are going to go out and do the same thing. Yeah. Okay, so now once we're sure that we have a female, that's when we're going to pick up this guide here. So this guide, you'll notice, is only for female bumblebees. Our males tend to have a little bit different color patterns. So when we collect bees, we're mostly going to be identifying females, although you can still submit observations of males. And I'm just going to go over 2 of our common species here, just so we can sort of test the knowledge of how to identify, and then Doug is Going to take you on a journey through the rest of that sheet. So when you are looking to identify, you have the sheet that you have passed out. We have this wonderful book here. I saw a few of you have. If you want to look at it, I have it up front. 2 PDF guides that are online and both free. These have good images in there. And then there's also the Bumble Bee Watch app that you can use when you're in the field. When we start to identify bees, right, you just want to look at 3 main parts. You're going to start with the head. You're going to look at the hairs on the front of the face and the top of the head. Once you have that figured out, you're going to look at the thorax, which is where the legs and the wings attach, that center part of the body. Here you want to look and see what color it is, and you want to see if there's a pattern. Is there a stripe between the wings? Is there a circle on it? You just want to notice what's going on in that section. And then once you have those 2, you're going to look at the abdomen. And you want to look at the color pattern on those tergites. And the tergites, again, are just the 6 sections that make up the whole abdomen. So here we see T1, which stands for tergite 1, right? T1 is yellow. The other 5 sections on her abdomen are black. So we can see that there's black on the front of the face, yellow on the top of the head. She's got a yellow thorax with a little bit of black hair in the center, and then 1 yellow tergite. So then we would take that information that we can see on our bee and look at the sheet and see what we have. And so we're just going to look at 2 species right here. So we're going to look at Bombus oricomis and Bombus pennsylvanicus, which when you are in the field, these are very difficult species to distinguish right off the bat. So first, when we look at the head, right, what 2 colors do we see? On the front of the face, we see black, but what about the top of the head? One's yellow and one's black, right? And then what about the thorax when we look there? In front of the wings, what color is it? What about in between the wings? And behind the wings? Yellow and black, and this one can also have yellow, right? So it can be tricky. So these are very similar species here that are out going to be flying around. And when we look at the abdomen, here's those 2 species we were just looking at, right? Very difficult to tell, but not impossible, right? So this is your first exposure to bumblebee identification. And these are 2 of the difficult ones that you're bound to see, and you're going to need to be able to distinguish. So the main character that I use in the field is the head, right? Because their bodies can be so similar with the color on the abdomen and the color on the thorax. So when you see a bee that looks like this, check out the head. This one has black on top, and this one has yellow. It's a very, very, very tiny characteristic. It's probably one of the harder ones to look at. So don't be scared, because we're going to have specimens that you can look at under a microscope so you can feel like you actually see this difference here and not just nodding your head with me. Yeah? But we're also going to go out into the field and catch these, and we're going to chill some and photograph them. So you are going to get to be up close and personal with these bees and feel like you have an understanding with them.